Well, it seems like Ben Bernanke bashing has become more popular. The latest swipes coming from Sarah Palin, who called the Fed's plans for additional stimulus or quantitative easing too downright scary. So the apolitical Fed, their decisions have become politicized right now. What's the economic reality here? We want to cut through the noise and bring in John Taylor of Stanford University. He has opposed further stimulus either from the Fed or from the Treasury, and he has served in a number of these key offices. In fact, he was Treasury undersecretary for international affairs. Welcome to the show, John. Thanks for joining us here on In Business today.
Good to be here.
I know you've opposed further sort of the juicing of the U.S. economic system in the past. What is it that worries you here? Do you think that the Fed is making it easier for fiscal policies to continue the way they are?
Well, I think the Fed's decision on QE2 is hopefully what they're trying to do is affect the unemployment rate, but I don't see it having that effect, and to me it raises a lot of risk. So I don't think it's a stimulus. I think that's the wrong word to use. I think it's questionable. I'm not quite sure why they're doing it. It's a lot of negative reaction. It does raise a lot of risks. So on the fiscal side, I think what we really need to do is to clarify what's happening on taxes, which is still a great uncertainty. I think if somehow you could agree not to raise taxes, that would be a stimulus. So think of stimulus in different ways.
We were talking about the mandate of full employment, and you were a bit of a skeptic in terms of the better than expected jobs numbers we've gotten.
Well, I think the job numbers are good. They're coming in. It's still, we got this high unemployment rate, and most people are projecting growth to stay pretty low right now, 2% or so for the current quarter. So that's not going to affect unemployment too much. So I think the most important thing for policy is to clarify what fiscal policy is going to be. And I mentioned tax rates and the debt. And at this point, monetary policy has just flooded with liquidity. So doing much more seems to me not productive at this point.
So when it comes to any kind of certainty on the fiscal front, what is it that investors should be anticipating here? I mean, what's the risk if we do see the extension of the tax cuts for just a year here?
Well, my preference would be just to say they're not going to increase at all for the foreseeable future. If we don't get that, I think postponing it as long as possible is going to be best. The fear, of course, is that we won't postpone at all and there'll be a tax increase, and that will be bad for investors. I think they've already built in some extension as far as I can tell. So if there's a disappointment there, it could be negative. But it's still a risk, and we don't know exactly what will happen in the Congress.
Kevin Warsh of the Fed has gotten some heat this week for comments that he made that said basically there is an onus that should be on Congress and on the fiscal side of things. Don't bet fully here on the Fed. But then, as we introed you, we just referenced the politicization of QE2 here. Do you think that the Fed itself, an apolitical body, is becoming unfairly politicized?
Actually, I don't think so. I think basically the Fed is, by these actions, moving into fiscal areas, and so it's doing things that are more than just regular monetary policy. It's very unusual. So I think it's reasonable for people to question and to point that out. We want to have a good monetary policy, and so if people have suggestions, I think it's quite reasonable. In the meantime, of course, this QE2 has politicized things internationally, with the President of the United States having to be out there defending it, and so it in itself has raised lots of questions politically.
So, Alan Meltzer wrote an editorial a while ago. I was just reading this morning to prepare for this interview, and he says that the only times we really saw the Fed live up to the mandate of high employment and price stability was when they failed your rule, the Taylor rule, and we had low inflation and stable growth. What should be applied right now?
Well, the Taylor rule says interest rates should be not too much different than what they are. If you plug in the numbers, it's about 75 basis points, so it's pretty close. Could be a little higher, but the main thing, not a lot lower, because some people say, hey, it should be minus 4%, and that justifies a lot of the quantitative easing. I don't see that. I think Alan Meltzer is a student of the Fed since its start, and he sees some good periods and bad periods, and we had good performance in much of the 80s and 90s. And this recent aberration is something we'd like to get over. And I think his proposal to follow rules-based policy makes a lot of sense. And I hope we get back to that soon. But QE2 is not a rules-based policy, highly discretionary interventionist policy.
When you hear vocal, sort of doubts being voiced by someone like Kevin Warsh about the efficacy or the fix-it-all sort of strategy of QE2, do you think there that perhaps the Fed might not go forward with all $600 billion of the purchases?
I think it's a real possibility. I hope so. They left themselves some wiggle room, and Kevin has been pretty clear that he's worried about it. You have new FOMC members come in. Of course, there's been dissension in the FOMC. And so I think there's a possibility, and I hope so, because I think going the whole way here at this point is not wise. But it's still probably the most likely forecast, quite frankly. And the Fed operates under consensus, so even if you have a few more dissenters, it might not change things that much.
All right. Well, we'd love to have you back on for a follow-up interview on this, John. Thank you for making time this morning.